As some of you know, um, in addition to working with the D-Word and having experience with other film organizations, um, and occasionally making documentary films, I'm also a writer. And I authored a book that just came out in December called Creative Resilience: Reclaiming Your Power as an Artist. I will put the link in the chat if the book is of interest to you. Um, I'll actually read a little section of it so you can get a taste of it. But today's session, even though it's covering some of the themes that are also covered in the book, there is no requirement that you have to have read the book or even my blog, which I think I did put a few samples in the confirmation email that some of you may have had a chance to look at. If you didn't, don't worry. But really, I wrote the book because, I really consider myself as someone who's been an uncertain artist my whole life, in various capacities. I was, in an advanced art program in high school. I ended up going into a theoretically non-artistic, I won't say non-creative, but a non-artistic field in international relations, and I actually still work in that field. And then I went to film school for my graduate degree and really got into documentary. So started making documentaries and then more importantly, I think really trying to support documentary filmmakers. I co-founded an organization called Docs in Progress in the Washington, D.C. area, which really just started out as a work in progress screening series and then evolved into becoming a nonprofit. And I was the founding executive director for about a decade. And the organization is still going strong. In fact, I just did a similar talk a few days ago there. But I was really, in dealing with my own creative process and also working with so many filmmakers, I really see, all the challenges that we deal with all the time. I mean, I think a lot of times people think our biggest challenge is getting funding. And yes, that is a huge challenge, or the actual process of getting people to, agree to be in our films or to, you know, deal with distribution. I mean, we will probably do a number of sessions this year that are dealing with different aspects of distribution. But I think sometimes we forget that so many of our challenges are really these seemingly simpler but very complex things about how we deal with the creative process, how we deal with motivation and keeping going when we, maybe don't feel very motivated, how we balance it with other things we're doing in our lives. It could be that you are like me, you have a whole other career in addition to your filmmaking, or maybe you have, a career where you do, works for hire, and then you're doing your own projects on the side. So just how we balance that, how we deal with, you know, obstacles that come our way, which could be, again, someone not wanting to participate, being able to find crew. We're often fundraising and having to sort of scrimp and save and, do things in a very slow manner. And then there's dealing with creative blocks, dealing with challenges of rejection, which comes all the time. I mean, I think part of the reason we wanted to do this session not only early in the year, but this is the week Sundance started. And, as Doug said, there can be many amazing things about Sundance, but I think for some people, it can also leave a little bit of bitterness in your mouth because, Sundance gets so many submissions every year. I'm sure all of us at one point or another might have either submitted, considered submitting to Sundance, and I'd be willing to bet that this group is very similar to the actual percentage of projects that get accepted for Sundance. And so that can be challenging because you can kind of feel like, where does my work fit in the marketplace? And by marketplace, it doesn't necessarily mean, selling it and getting, millions of dollars and accolades and a Sundance premiere and an Oscar, win. But just to how you get your film out into the world to, be seen and engaged with other people, and hopefully make a difference to those who see it. So, I think there are a lot of aspects of our work that are really challenging. And I think that's why, or things like this, where we come together and we can share, are so important. So what I was planning to do today, I'll do a very short reading from the book, from one of the chapters of the book that's about vulnerability. And then, I'll kind of lead us into breakouts. We'll be doing a 30-minute breakout today where you will get to choose your own adventure, essentially. We'll have 4 different topics that we can discuss. And I'll just give you a hint of what those are right now. We'll be talking about confidence and specifically imposter syndrome, which I could tell you more about what that means in a minute. We'll be talking about accountability, creative blocks, and failure, my favorite. And those conversations will be facilitated, but it's really going to be an opportunity for you to share your experiences, questions, challenges with one of those topics. And then we'll hopefully have some time to come back together in the big group and maybe share back a bit, because I'm sure for some of you, you're like, which one do I choose? Because I would be interested in several. So let me start with a little reading from the book. And this is my first time doing a virtual reading, so bear with me if I'm looking down. But it is from a chapter called Cover Up, and I start each chapter with a quote from someone, and so this one starts with, "To be alive is to be vulnerable." Madeleine L'Engle. For many years in Docs in Progress, I facilitated feedback sessions for filmmakers to share and discuss their works in progress. Sometimes the feedback was intended to be purely about the art. Sometimes it was intended to be about how the artist pitched the art. In either case, it was an exposure of artist vulnerability in all its glory. Some filmmakers responded far too quickly to the feedback, wanting to defend every creative decision the second anyone in the group expressed any confusion or constructive criticism. Others reacted to the feedback with few words, but with body language that revealed their inner turmoil. One filmmaker even paced back and forth like a tiger in the zoo outside the room where the film was being discussed, leaving his co-director to face the feedback alone. After more than a decade of witnessing variations on this, it was my turn as I held a focus group for a film I was working on and invited a select group of trusted colleagues, including some for whom I had hosted film critique sessions previously. By then, I had facilitated feedback workshops for more than 100 films and knew how helpful the process could be. But that logic gave way to emotion as soon as the lights went up and my colleagues gave me feedback. I became the silent listener on the outside while my insides crumbled. Somehow I was able to hold it together, asking questions and making copious notes about everyone's reactions. It would be a good month before I could face reading those notes. The film would ultimately be better because of the feedback, but the in-the-moment experience felt like a root canal. As someone who prides herself on being able to make others feel as comfortable as possible when they're sharing their creative work, I was ironically unable to feel comfortable when my work was subjected to review. Vulnerability is a strange thing. It is something that artists who make portraits, whether through writing, painting, photography, or film, seek to explore through their work. When it is possible to capture someone else's vulnerability through our art, it is seen as a high achievement. Yet less lauded is the ability for artists to come to terms with and expose our own vulnerabilities. It is partially because many of our social institutions associate being vulnerable with weakness or incompetence. The word vulnerability derives from the Latin noun vulnus, meaning wound, and usually leans towards being susceptible to physical, mental, or emotional harm. In recent years, it's gotten a bit of a rebrand from people like author and scholar Brené Brown, who connects vulnerability to uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. To face a blank canvas, to turn the inkling of an idea into a story or song, to build up or whittle away a sculpture from raw materials is about taking a risk. To continue to create when you have no idea where that process will lead you aesthetically or professionally is about confronting uncertainty. Sharing your process and your work, acknowledging self-doubt, embracing failure, or letting go of something that is not working all involve emotional exposure. It should be noted that being vulnerable is not the same as being an open book. We still have to operate in various worlds, our inner self in balance with the outer marketplace for our art, and the world writ large, all rife with contradictions. We have to wear protective masks from time to function and move forward within such a complex environment. And the chapter goes on. I'm going to actually stop there because I do want us to get into the slightly more interactive part of this. But essentially, I go on to talk a bit about different kinds of masks that we use to protect ourselves. And that's normal. And in fact, for those of you who are interested in talking more about imposter syndrome, I actually want to talk about what that is so that you know if that's the group that you're interested in, what you'd be getting into. Because imposter syndrome in many ways is something that I'm not alone in facing. I face it all the time. I actually had a funny conversation the other day with Mitch where we're talking about this, and I was just saying, oh, would you like to, facilitate one of these sessions? And he said, I don't know if I can do it. And I said, you don't have to be an expert in it. I'm not either. And he kind of joked with me, well, like, but you just wrote this book. Of course you're an expert in it. I'm like, no, I still have imposter syndrome. And that's sort of that feeling that no matter what you accomplish, you always feel a little bit like a phony or a fraud, or like, who am I? Why am I an expert on anything? And so and you've probably seen it here from time to time. I often have a kind of self-deprecating, way about me. And Doug always sets me aright and says, no, you have to be able to, promote your book and what you're working on, because, it's not just about self-promotion. It's about putting something out into the world that may resonate and help other people. So, so a lot of, talking about imposter syndrome is also about confidence. And a lot of what I do in the book is sort of reframe language. So I think a lot of times we think of, either you have confidence or you don't have confidence. And I think that's really too limiting. I think we all have different measures of confidence, and they may vary. I always liken it to sort of like you're on a pendulum. And so sometimes you can feel really confident. Like the other day after I did my reading and signing, and people were coming up and asking questions and buying the book. And, I was like, I'm super confident right now. But then an hour before this, I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to have to say that's going to resonate with these other documentary people. Who am I? Any one of them could probably lead this discussion. So, so it's not something you have or don't. It's something that's going to vary and depend on a lot of different factors. For those of you who are interested in talking more about accountability, that was a big part for me of writing this book. I actually partnered with another person, Richard Chisholm, who also was writing a book, which also came out recently, called Documentary Vision. I hope we can have him on at some point in one of these maybe focused face-to-faces, because he's an accomplished director of photography and director, who's really reflecting on his years working in documentary. But yeah, we both didn't know what we were doing. We've never written books before. And so we just said, well, since we don't know, let's just work together. And we sort of committed, this was in the early days of the pandemic, that we would each write a chapter every week, share it with each other, and get feedback. So aside from, the fears of getting feedback, that's a lot. That's, a big commitment. But you know what? We did it for 6 months. And I don't think I would have even completed the first draft of this book without that process. So, for those of you in the accountability group, you'll probably be talking a bit about, ways that you yourselves find accountability to move forward with your projects, or to just feel part of that community. And AK will be helping to facilitate that topic. I should have said Malikkah will be helping to facilitate the one on imposter syndrome. And then there are creative blocks. And I don't know that I necessarily even have to go deep into that topic. That's sort of when we're working on something and all of a sudden we're not, and we, feel stuck. And ways to move forward. And I know I've experienced that myself. I'm a admitted perfectionist, and that I think can be a big part of dealing with blocks. And sometimes it can just be you have a lot happening in your life and you need to kind of, take a break, and then it can be sometimes difficult to get back into it. So Doug Block will actually be leading the
Being a
discussion on
creative
creative
block
block.
myself,
Yeah.
yes.
So and then the final topic is one of my favorites, failure. And I'm putting that out there because I love failure. I am an expert at failure, and I am sure there are lots of experts here. Julie's going to be facilitating that session. But really, I think that also comes back to, do we see failure as an end game? Is it the opposite of success, or is it something that you need to experience to get to success? And also, what is success anyway? And sort of how we define that. And I always like to think of it, sort of liken it to, how we are in the arts versus how people are in the sciences. Failure is a crucial part for scientific experimentation. You're not going to move forward on, finding cures for things if you don't try out different things and fail at most of them. But the scientist is not necessarily going to associate what's, in their petri dish not working or not getting them to the conclusion they were hoping, with their own personal, self. Whereas I think a lot of times in the arts, those two things become sort of combined, so that, having a professional failure becomes like a personal failure. So, I think we can kind of talk a little bit more about that. So essentially what we're going to do is Julie is going to open up 4 breakout sessions. For those of you who've been on classic breakouts, you know that in the past we often, randomly put you in a breakout and you get to meet each other and talk. In this one, you're going to choose your own breakout session based on the topic that's of most interest to you. And so some of them might be a lot of people, some might be small people. We limited it to 4 just so, people don't have too many choices. And then we'll be in those breakouts for about 30 minutes. The facilitator's really there, not necessarily as an expert, although some of them certainly do have some experience with the topic at hand, but just to kind of keep the conversation moving. So you'll have a chance to introduce yourselves. Obviously, not everybody knows each other, but then maybe to sort of talk a little bit more about the theme, about your experiences with it, about questions you may have, like, how do I form an accountability group? What should I be looking for? I mean, so it can be pretty specific. It can also be sort of bigger picture and more philosophical. It's however you want it to be. So we'll be in those breakouts for about 30 minutes, which will probably still feel like not enough time. And then, we'll have some time to come back together in the big group. And then if folks do want to sort of share back or pick up conversations that started in the breakouts for the benefit of the big group, we can do that. So does that make sense to everyone? All right. So let us go ahead and get into our breakouts. Welcome back, everybody. I was lucky enough that I had the chance to move between groups, and I saw discussions in all of them that were very good. I'm sure there was much more to say. I know the one I was just in, someone was cut off mid-word. And so one thing I really noticed in some of what I did observe is how much overlap there is between these. And I know several people were saying, oh, I kind of wonder what's happening in this other group because we're kind of talking about that topic too. And so that's why I really wanted us to have this opportunity now that we're back together to kind of pick up on some of those topics. And first of all, big thanks to the folks who are moderating. You are all doing an amazing job of keeping the conversation going and contributing your own thoughts, experiences, and, kind of discussing it in different ways. So, whether it's the moderators or someone else from the group who'd like to maybe share or ask a question like, does this relate to something else? Now's the time. Just a reminder for those of you who may have come in late that we are recording today's session. If you want to share, but don't want the recording of your share included in the edited version of this that we'll be putting up on YouTube, just say that prior to talking. We want to honor that. And so the best way to share now is to do what Ty just did, and he'll be up first, which is to click on the raise hand function, which I think for most of us is in the reactions. So Ty, turning it over to you.
At the very end of the Creative Block group, Peter Crosby brought up a very interesting idea. I don't want to speak too much for him, but the idea was basically, what if you no longer believe in your project? And when I heard that, I was like, oh man, I like really tuned in to what was going on, because I think that actually the answer to that might be the other group, which is accountability. Because when you start something, you should have that thing in your head where even when you're going through the ups and downs, you're accountable to finish it. Like you need to start and finish something. And that's, I think, as artists, something that we have to learn throughout our experience anyways, is how to finish things that we start. But yeah, Peter, like that was big, and we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but I wanted to bring it up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to pick up specifically on that before we move on to other questions? I have some thoughts about it, but I'd love to hear from some other folks. Ching, is that what you wanted to respond to that, or do you have something new?
Yes, I was just thinking the same thing. No one is responsible for your film if it is your writer, your producer. You are the one is the captain of the ship. So you have to, not necessarily you will be every day on the money, but you have to find a way, find a therapist and find some pills to take. But I'm just joking. Yeah, I feel like in many things, in a relationship, in the health and sector, in this filmmaking thing, because you are the producer. And also, if you run into problems of having people believing you, make a short film first. Make a short film and show people you can do it from beginning to the end. Because the producers or funders, they want to see you can do a project, not just say, I want to do a project. That's it.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that? I mean, it's interesting because I write about this a little bit in the book of, the sort of how you can kind of go through the ups and downs and dealing with the blocks and try to get through them. But I also write at a certain point about when to quit. And I don't necessarily agree that every project has to be seen through completion. I think I agree you should do everything. I think you should understand why you're having the block or whatever is holding you back. For some people, it may just be, I need money to make this film and I can't make it if nobody funds it. For other people, specifically in film, it could be that, something has changed. Maybe a person you were hoping to have as the center of your film has passed away. I mean, you may not actually be able to make the film or not in the original way. So I think it's sort of finding ways, and I think this is where all of the topics kind of intersect, that accountability to other people to keep you going as much as you can, or maybe repurposing your film. One of the artists I talked to actually talked a lot about that sometimes he'll actually stop working on a project that he'd been working on for a long time, but that doesn't mean that aspects of what he'd been doing don't necessarily feed another project. So it may just be, maybe this doesn't work best as a feature. Maybe it is a short, or maybe this isn't best as a film and it could be, you know, an article, you know, or something that you put, you know, kind of very short thing online. So I think it's sort of that it's always walking that very fine line between quitting and not wanting to be a quitter, versus, you know, knowing when to kind of move forward. And sometimes you know, I have a project I've quit and it was very painful to finally admit this is not something that's going to happen. But I've learned from that, and actually it helped me a lot when I went on to the next project. So JD.
In our group, we talked about failure. And I think the key takeaway, at least for me, listening to everyone else's input, is that failure is a chance at feedback. So it is a moment where you are receiving information that you may not have intended to receive at that moment that can help you move forward and make better decisions in the future.
Very well said. Does anybody else from the failure group want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll add something. We also, Jimmy especially brought up the kind of fear that that you can't control what is going to come in. So the fear is also about how you will react to things that you can't control, and that can create this feeling of failure even without. This is me speaking now, not Jimmy, but it can create this feeling of failure without really having done anything, because you're kind of anticipating how something might hurt you or how you will feel when things come to you if you put something out.
Yeah. Stephen.
Yeah, these are really great points. And I was taking a look at the master class with Ken Burns some time ago. And on that master class, there's a section of it where he goes and opens up a drawer, and it's all the projects they started and never finished. Right. And it was really revealing. And we forget about that, right? Because we only react to the things that are on, or in my case too, Robert Duvall, who wanted to make a personal film after all the Godfather movies and thought it would be a slam dunk and nobody would finance his film. And yet he still got it made. But we sometimes, because we're only working on that one thing that's personal to us, and we're holding on to it so tight, you know, Erica coming to the point of saying, oh my gosh, am I really on the wrong path here? And I have been for 5 years. What am I gonna? That makes it really hard for us to do that. And we end up staying on longer because of it. You know what I mean? As opposed to taking that with us. And I think this is one of those things, is that we really have to look at it as I think JD was talking about failure. It is, there are no failures, right? It's just what we take with us forward. And I think we need to just be confident about that. So.
Thank you. Or be along that confidence spectrum that I was talking about earlier. Malikkah.
Well, this is somewhat similar to what was just said, but I think we actually cause ourselves a lot of suffering by using that word failure at all. In the sense of, I don't think anything is a failure. I don't think you can fail. I don't really know what that even means. I think maybe you try something and it does not turn out the way that you hoped, but then like in a way, if you can have this kind of mindset, not always easy, but what an amazing opportunity to kind of figure out why this thing did not work the way I wanted. And then what do I need to do to like change course? So I know, Erica, I know you used the word failure in your book, but I really need to challenge that. I don't think there is such a thing as failure. I think it's something that we've created in our heads. And frankly, if we keep living with that word failure and using it, I think we're just creating a lot more suffering for ourselves.
I'm happy you're challenging me on that.
I know you are. I
I
know you
always
well
like
enough
being
to know
challenged.
you're like, bring on the challenge.
Yeah, because I think it also comes down to, a lot of what I'm trying to write about are these words that are very heavy, that we've kind of just internalized as this negative thing. And so in writing about it, I actually got to the end and I said, the word failure gets a bad rap. There's other words I read about, spite, amateur, a bunch of different things that I think often get a bad rap. So it may just be that we're looking at that word differently, but I think failure is amazing.
And frankly, it is the best friggin' teacher, y'all. Oh my God. It's such a phenomenal teacher. Like to what extent can we open ourselves up to the times when stuff does not work like we want? Things we put out there don't work like we want. What a beautiful teacher for ourselves. It's fabulous.
Right. Thank you, Malikkah. Antoine.
Yeah, when we talk about failure and the parallel which is success, the thing is we need to somehow define what it is. Is failure the act of doing something and not being able to complete what we're doing, which is one thing? Or is it we have completed the work to the best of our ability, send it out in the world, but the reception of the people, the public and the readers and the audience or whatever, didn't take it the way we expected. And there's a big difference between the two. The first one is something that is related to your ability, to your skills, to what you can train yourself on. And there's a certain amount of things you can do about that. The second one, which is once your creation, once your documentary or film or article or your book, whatever is out in the world, you don't have control anymore. And to take yourself, to make yourself responsible for this working out once it's outside is not really fair, because it's completely out of your hands. And I think it's important to differentiate the two and to understand what we can have somehow control over, which is the creative process, which is before it goes out into the world. And once it's out into the world, well, there's not much you can bang your head against the wall and say, but this is the best work I've done. If people don't like it, they don't like it. And it's not your fault. And it's absolutely not your fault.
Thank you, Antoine. I really appreciate you saying that, because the way I like to think about it is there's a triangle. And so there's the artist, the art, and the audience, which obviously audience can mean a lot of different things. And so you as the artist have a relationship with the art. You also have a relationship with the audience where you can try to influence them in some way. But ultimately, there's that third relationship, which is the audience and the art. And you don't have full control over that, of how people are going to view it, interpret it, have it resonate, have it not resonate. And also that means, the audience you may think is your audience may turn out to not be your audience. So those are all really important things to say. I just want to address a couple things that were coming up in the chat. Someone had asked if we recorded the breakouts because they were interested in what was discussed in the other breakouts. No, the breakouts were not recorded, which is why we're having this time to sort of share back. And I would actually, before we get to Doug, AK, and Ty, I wanted to ask Julie, because I noticed in your breakout you were doing a lot of things in the chat, which would only be seen by those folks in the chat. So, if you perhaps wanted to even put one of those questions that you were sort of asking people in the chat so other folks could weigh in the chat, that would be great, because I know you were in the group that was talking about failure. And I will turn it over now to Doug.
I'm not going to report back on the creative blocks thing. I think if anybody who was in there wants to share, they can. It was more people sharing what their blocks were, as opposed to putting out tips that they have for overcoming creative blocks. But I'm actually kind of intrigued by this idea of failure, to get back to that for a second. I mean, I've had several projects that I've done that for one reason or other just didn't work out. You know, I initially wanted to make fiction films, not documentaries. And after my first documentary, I worked on this kind of hybrid project. It was I wanted to appear like a documentary. It was such a great idea. I was so excited about it, and I was using actors for the first time. And it's a very interesting story, but way too long to talk about. But it just didn't work out, and I had to pull the plug on it. And within a month, I was working on the documentary homepage, which had it had the character. I found the character that I wished I would have had in this fiction film, but he was like so much more interesting in real life than anything I could have invented. And I don't think, I think it just grew out of this interest I had. It was all around the early internet and how email at that time and the internet was changing human relationships and the way friendships and affairs, you know, struck up just by projecting yourself through emails and online communication. And then, you know, it directly impacted that next film. So I think, you know, I don't think of these things as failures. I think of them as all part of a process, a creative process. I've learned so much from these projects that got stalled. And I think, you know, it's all a matter of, like, you know, when you're walking in the woods, you go down a path that looks really interesting, and then all of a sudden you realize you've come to a dead end. So you backtrack and you go down another path. But there's, you know, all sorts of beauty and stuff on that path that you went down. So I think I don't think of it as failure. You know, I think of it as, I mean, it could be failure, you know, I mean, that's a term, but it's a block. It's a creative block.
Great, thank you. Or maybe we should think of them not as creative blocks, but as creative opportunities.
Right.
So, all right, AK.
That was a good line. Creative opportunities, not blocks. We had a few interesting conversations and accountability about how sometimes the thrill of the short-term thrills kind of keep us from getting things done. And Andrea had a great quote, which I'll invite her to share about. Andrea, do you want to share that?
Sure. We were talking about being of help to each other and reviewing and so on and so forth. And it made me remember a saying that we have in my family that can apply to more categories than that. But it's easier or more fun to weed someone else's garden than our own. And so it's, yeah, rather do that than try to get my own work done.
Totally. And in that vein, like, you know, when we have the courage to ask each other for support, and being able to do that for others helps them move forward. And in a way, you know, you get that exchange of short-term thrill energy that then helps you motivate to your work. So those accountability groups can be really helpful at times. I randomly shared I got back into salsa randomly 2 weeks ago, and the thrill of having to be able to go do that in the evening has been fueling energy into getting shit done in the mornings. So you never know what's gonna work.
Very nice. Love both of those shares. So thank you. Ty.
I wanted to share, I got inspired by you mentioning there might be a time to quit earlier, and I totally agree. I usually consider it, might be a good time to put it aside, like you were also mentioning, is maybe go do something else. I have a really good example of maybe the technical side, which was Doug was talking about, is no one talks about the technical, but it's a good reminder to everybody, even if you're doing a project and you're putting a lot of time into it, it's not going anywhere, definitely find a way to keep that for the rest of your life somewhere on drives or on the cloud. Because I was working at a marketing agency where this guy came from New York City. He worked with like Glenn O'Brien, if you guys know, the old New York City underground artist. He was on a thing called TV Party. This guy had been filming TV Party in New York City when he was young, and they did nothing with it. It was more of a public access thing. But he was the only one out of all these, you know, whatever, 40, 50 people that kept the footage. And about 40 years later, 35, 40 years later, he then sold a bunch of it to Vice because they wanted to revisit the old TV party stuff. So whatever you have, do not forget to keep it, because it might be worth something later down the line and you don't even know what that could be yet.
That's a great point. Don't just, even if you quit, don't throw it away. And kind of speaking both to your point and AK's, I think also, I love that example, AK, about the salsa dancing, because I think another thing, and I don't know if this came up in the Creative Blocks group, but is just to sometimes when you're having stress with your own project in your own discipline, it's good to try something else out that you have no stake in, that maybe is a completely different art form, or maybe it's just like a 1-day, art class or something you're going to, but just something that is using your creative juices, because sometimes that can sort of reinvigorate those juices that you can then bring back into your own project. But it's just, you don't have, like if I go and take a painting class, I don't care if I make a good painting, I'm not selling it to anybody. But it definitely helps keep that creative flow going. So, other thoughts, anything anybody wants to share or ask about from their group, or ask of somebody who was in one of the other groups? We have about 5 minutes left, so we probably have time for one more comment or question. Or a lot of uncomfortable silence,
Erica,
which I'm also okay with.
I'm curious, like, what are the big questions you're getting when going around with your book?
Yeah, so I mean, going around, I've had 2 readings so far before this, and I have some other things coming up soon. But yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of the motivation for the book, how I kept it going. A lot of people, I think, have asked why, is it a broad book? Why not just something for filmmakers? Because that's the world I know. And that was actually the evolution of the book, because originally it was something that was going to be written just for documentary filmmakers about our process. But in talking to people, a lot of the things I wanted to write about are really much broader, and they apply to all kinds of art forms. And so I'm not an expert in any of other art forms. So I had to, make an intention to talk to people from those forms. So it's not a memoir, even though the section I read, was about something personal. I obviously use some personal anecdotes, but it's a mix of anecdotes and sort of reframing language and kind of talking about some of these things. But also, I interviewed 11 different artists across disciplines, people from different backgrounds, different ages, different places where they live. And I'm thankful to a few people here who connected me with some of those folks. So, I think that is sort of finding those commonalities that, what we're going through as filmmakers is really not that different than what someone who's, a dancer or a sculptor, or a musician is going through. I had a really interesting question the other day, which I couldn't quite answer, but I think I'm going to use it as something for a future blog post, which is sort of how I distinguish between the creative process and the creative journey, because I think sometimes I might use those words a little bit interchangeably. And so I'm actually about to go on vacation for a week, which is another thing I recommend if you can do it. Doesn't mean you have to spend thousands of dollars and, go to other places, but just to take a break. It's really important for us to have time for rest, reset, rejuvenation. And I know that can be really challenging when you're, working on a deadline, or you're a freelancer and you, you need the money. But it's so crucial. So I'm hoping to kind of think about that particular question a bit more while I am resting.
Another question for you. What did you do when you faced your own creative blocks, or, fear of failure, or?
Yeah. Well, I
things-
still face the fear of failure. I mean, I wrote that, I think I was in the failure group and, Julie was doing one of her questions and I said, I don't know anything about publishing. This is my first book. I don't know what I'm doing. And, I don't even know what the metrics of success are. So, which is both bad, but also good because I kind of feel like, oh, I'm like a beginner again. And there's something fun about having that beginner's mind of, just being able to kind of do whatever and we'll see what sticks. And not feeling afraid of it because I don't really know what the alternatives are. But can you repeat your first question, Doug? Because I was going to answer it, and then I got stuck on the second
if
one.
you in the course of writing the book, did you encounter your own blocks?
Yeah,
What did you do to overcome them?
Yeah. So, as I said, I had an accountability partner. We worked together for about 6 months. I came up with the first draft of the book and I was like, oh, it's great. Maybe I'll have a couple of other beta readers read it, start to try and get an agent or a publisher. And the feedback I was getting, I mean, people were really interested in it, but they said it's way too short. And suddenly I was kind of stuck because I felt I don't want to be repetitive. I don't want to just write for the sake of writing. Me, anyone who knows me, my biggest issue with most documentary films is that they're too long. But I also recognize there's a length that's perfect for festivals and theatrical screenings. And so a lot of times people are building their films around that. When I'm like, gosh, you could say the same thing in 45 minutes, but you're never going to get your film shown anywhere at that length, at least in terms of festivals. Or TV. So back to the book, I got stuck because I was like, I have no idea what else I can write about. So I sort of put it aside for 4 months. And then talking about rest, I had some user lose leave for my job. So I essentially had 3 weeks off at the end of the year. And somehow just through that process of being able to stop thinking about everything else, I was able to kind of come up with, some more things I wanted to say. And then from that, I actually added some artists to interview who could speak to those. So that was sort of where I was talking more about, the connections between making art and being a cheerleader for art, professionally, whether that's working in an organization, doing like what Doug did, founding the D-Word, teaching, that sort of thing, and sort of talking about that, talking a bit about amateurs and where they fit in all of this. And I'm very deliberate in the book of I don't like the word hobbyist and I don't like the word professional because that implies somehow that the money is what makes the difference into whether you're a real artist or not. So I have a whole section about people who, do this on the side and are not necessarily doing it for a living. So yeah, I would say that the key sometimes is just time, changing things, sort of switching it up a little bit, and and just finding different ways, whether it's through an accountability group, through testing some other kind of art form, to just sort of, find your feet again with the project. And I was able to do that. And really happy to see the response so far. And I hope some of you will be curious and check out the book. And even if you don't, check out the blog and definitely keep coming back to these face-to-faces because I think these we're having a special session on this, but I have a feeling these topics, we'll keep talking about them throughout the course of these D-Word face-to-faces. So we can pick up on these topics in future sessions.